Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Waterway Stories, the annual conference of the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program. Thank you all for joining us here today, bright and early, 9 a.m. Hope everybody has their cup of coffee. We are really excited for this panel to really kick us off today. We're doing this panel, it's envisioning, envisioning safer blue and green spaces. And we're doing this today in partnership with the Billion Oyster Project. So I think it's going to be really great. I will kick us off to Tatiana Castro, who is the moderator for this session. And just if you have any questions for the panelists, put it in the Q&A. That's right next to the Whova screen. And I will make sure that Tatiana gets all the questions for the panels that are going to present today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. And thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to kick off this panel. So I'm going to quickly introduce myself so that you guys can get an understanding of who I am and what I do at the Billion Oyster Project. And I'm going to then introduce our panelists for today. But before all that, I just wanted to quickly introduce you guys to the reasoning for why we're doing this panel today. And so, like Isabel said, the title of this panel is Envisioning Safer Blue and Green Spaces, a panel discussion on intersectional environmentalism. And so, in the spirit of fostering a safe, inclusive, and equitable environment, the Billion Oyster Project is proud to present an intersectional environmentalism panel in partnership with the Harbor Estuary Program, which most of us know as HEP, to explore how diverse groups use green and blue spaces in their disciplines and why safety and access to those spaces is vital. This panel will feature 4 unique environmental professionals who will discuss the ideas presented in environmental access through their creative fields and in conjunction with the safe space commitment. So for those of you who are joining us today that have not heard of the safe space commitment, we will be discussing it a little bit more in depth a little later on, but this was also something that was discussed actually in the Waterways Harbor Estuary Program Stories Conference. So if you guys did not tune in and would like to learn more about it, you can definitely find out more about it on our website, which is billionoysterproject.org. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just give you a little blurb about me and then introduce you to our panelists. So once again, hello, my name is Tatiana Castro, and I will be your moderator for this panel. I am the Restoration Field Coordinator at the Billion Oyster Project, and I have been working here for about 2.5 years now. And I am also the Vice Chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which is the committee that put this panel together and has been working really hard to make sure that we can bring this to you guys today. I was born and raised in Cali, Colombia, which is in South America. And I always found myself being drawn to nature and wildlife and wanting to be the ones who always conserve and protect anything that had to do with Mother Nature, which is probably the reason why I'm currently working in this field and for this wonderful organization, which is the Billion Oyster Project. But enough about myself. I would like to introduce you to our very first panelist. I wanted to quickly thank you guys once again. I know I spoke to you guys on a separate note, but I just wanted to thank you for being here. So first off, we have Makalé Faber Kulin. She is an African-American cultural anthropologist specializing in interfaces between cultures and ecologies. She is with us this morning and is most closely working and talking about her experiences working in Jamaica Bay with USDA and RCS Soil Sciences and the YNC Soil and Water Conservation District's Urban Soil Institute. For almost 20 years before her work in the Bay and continuing today, she brings ethnographic and material perspectives to multiple fields: agriculture, architecture, supply chains, and low impact manufacturing. Makalé also spent several years documenting North American crop biodiversity, co-directing a national conservation program with Seed Savers Exchange, while the director of the biodiversity program for Slow Food. So Makalé has been doing a lot over the years. She was also in the University of Virginia's PhD anthropology program and holds an undergraduate degree from George Mason University. And also holds a certificate in horticulture from the New York Botanical Garden. She is a contributing actor to 4 books and numerous articles. And she is currently finishing Oasis, a book about High Bridge Park in Manhattan, doing GIS mapping and working with African diaspora communities on dry farmed rice. Next up, we have Kristiy Drutman. She is a Jewish Filipina environmental media creator and founder of Brown Girl Green. So if you have not checked out her Instagram, I would highly suggest you do. Which this Instagram is, well, her title, Brown Girl Green, is a media platform exploring the intersections between media, diversity, and environmentalism. As a sustainability communications expert, Kristiy has spoken in front of thousands, as well as facilitated workshops centered around environmental media and storytelling in cities across all over the United States. She has also worked with youth from around the world to create collaborative, intersectional online media with the goal of creating conscious, cultural, relevant content to engage audiences about proactive solutions to the climate crisis. So the content that she provides is for audiences of all ages. So she really puts it in a way that everyone can really understand, no matter the age, no matter your background. She just really finds a way to connect with everyone and in a way that everyone can understand. Next up, we have Alan Michelson. He is an internationally recognized New York-based artist, curator, writer, lecturer, and Mohawk member of the 6 Nations of the Grand River. For over 30 years, he has been a leading practitioner of a socially engaged, critically aware, site-specific art grounded in local context and informed by the retrieval of repressed histories. Recent exhibitions include Greater New York 2021 at MoMA PS1, and Alan Michelson, Wolf Nation at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He is also the curator of Object of Relations, Indigenous Belongings, an upcoming exhibition at Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery, featuring the contemporary work of 4 Indigenous women artists. His essays have recently appeared in Aperture, Frieze, and October, and was featured in a recent profile in the New York Times. Michelson's practice includes award-winning public art and mantle. His monument honoring Virginia's Native Nations was dedicated at the Capitol in Richmond in 2018. His work in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian, the National Gallery of Canada, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. So that's a lot. Michelson is co-founder and co-curator of the groundbreaking Indigenous New York series with the Vera List Center of Art and Politics at the New School, where he currently serves on the advisory board. He is a curational advisor of the Global Indigenous Initiative, ACBAWAD. And I hope I am pronouncing that right. If not, Michael, Alan, please let me know.
It's Abaquad.
Abaquad. Okay, thank you. And last but not least, we have Priya Parrotta. She is a writer, a musician, and activist dedicated to promoting environmental consciousness across borders. She is the founder and creative director of Music and the Earth International. Music and the Earth is an initiative which produces decolonial and multicultural resources for environmental awareness and healing. Priya works her work is informed by her close connections to South Asia, the Mediterranean, and the Latin Caribbean. She authored her first book, The Politics of Coexistence in the Atlantic World, at the age of 25. And her second book project is titled The Dream Again, Imagining Island Solidarity Through Music. As both a writer and musician, she explores themes such as encounter, hybridity, and creative resistance. She composes, sings, and produces music to convey the magic and the power that is possible when people embrace their connections to the earth. Priya has been nominated for the United States Artist Fellowship and has been recognized internationally for weaving bridges between music and diverse branches of environmental thought and action. So that is a little introduction of our panelists today. I just wanted to give you guys some sort of a layout of how we plan to go through our panel today. So this is going to be a panel, which is mostly discussion based. The panel will consist of, 4 main questions that we're going to be kind of focusing on for the rest of the panel. And we're just going to have one panelist lead each question. And then we're just going to kind of try and popcorn around the room, virtually, of course, to address the challenges, opportunities, and solutions to improve access and inclusion in blue and green spaces within various fields of environmental work. We do expect to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on each section, and then at the end, we're going to have a live Q&A. So with that being said, if you guys want to kind of just shoot any questions that you may have while we're discussing in the chat, please do so. Feel free to do so. We will try and get to as many questions as we can. But if anybody has any comments or anything, just feel free to let us know. We will be kind of moderating that as well and monitoring the questions that are coming in. And with that being said, why don't we get started? So the first question that we have for our panel today is, describe a foundational experience around the environment, blue or green, that might have led to your work today. And Kristiy, why don't you start us off with that one?
Yeah, I would say a foundational experience for me, and actually it's, the 8-year anniversary since Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, and that's where my family is from. That was a really important moment in my life when I was an undergrad in university, because it was the first time that I genuinely felt like climate change felt more personal to me, and it made me realize that environmental issues, while it will impact everyone in some degree, that it was specifically impacting people who look like me, came from my cultural background, people who look like my family members, having their entire villages and barangays like swept away in these floods, and it was really a huge moment for me, especially when someone who really inspires me, Yabsano, went on a hunger strike for the climate negotiations that were happening that year. And I realized like how mission critical it was to talk about these stories about communities on the front lines of the climate crisis not really being addressed or taken seriously, especially in these very bureaucratic forums and rooms. And I was like, what is the disconnect here? These people from all these wealthy countries and these spaces get access to, these international forums to decide what's going to happen to the planet. Meanwhile, there's people on the ground having their communities swept away and having to starve themselves just for people to take them seriously. And I saw that there was such a huge disconnect between creating an environmental narrative that actually empowers people towards action or keeps people in power to maintain that power. And so it became more apparent to me that there were all these power dynamics And I think that really led me to trying to investigate how powerful storytelling is, and that it's not just this nice to have thing, that it actually influences policy decisions. It influences how resources are distributed and what communities do or don't get prioritized when it comes to emergency situations. And so I would say that I realized that my role as a storyteller and a cultural shifter was actually a part of trying to investigate those power dynamics and trying to break down very racist history that the environmental field has had, especially in the US, but even imperialism worldwide, and trying to push environmental initiatives forward that don't necessarily prioritize communities on the front lines. And so I realized I wanted a platform that could hold the space for that nuance, because I felt like I, in my university classes and other young people of color, felt like that wasn't being properly represented. So I would say that that was kind of my thread. Started with seeing this disaster, to recognizing that it wasn't just this disaster. There's so many more disasters that are going to happen to specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities if these stories aren't told. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristiy, for that. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in and give us a little bit of background on their experiences and how it, intertwines around the environment that has led to the work that you've done up until this day?
I can go next. This is Makalé. Thank you, Kristiy, by the way, for all your work and for bearing witness with a lot of integrity. So for me, I think my foundational experience was my grandparents' island. So they lived in a small island. There are 2 islands on the North Shore of Long Island. They moved there sort of in the 1950s. And so my mother spent her last 2 years of high school out there. She's originally from the Bronx, and it's called Morgan's Island, but I spent quite a bit of my childhood there. And there were just a few houses on the island at the time and 2 bridges that you had to cross. And I literally, when the weather was nice, I spent from sunrise to sunset at the beach, and it's the Long Island Sound. And I really got to know the water and the tides. And one thing I would say is that because it was a private island, there's a public section across one of the bridges where you had clam and mussel diggers. And I remember early on kind of wondering why they couldn't come onto the other side. We can talk more about that later. And I would say the second very strong influence on me comes from my family on my father's side, we are from Guinea, from Conakry, which is a peninsula. And there's Ile de Los that's just across a short boat ride away. And I would say that because of that waterfront, kind of working waterfront experience that my father grew up in, I had a very strong sense of working waterfronts. And I spent, when I wasn't in New York, I was in the DC area. And so I spent every weekend on the Potomac River or the Chesapeake Bay, getting fish from fishermen. And I think that I just had a deep literacy about the water, especially because fish was such a large part of my diet. Our diet is Susu, or our ethnic group is Susu. I just learned about what was in the sea and our relationship to it. And I realize now that I knew so many species of fish, and I understood their anatomy because we had to gut them. I mean, all of the things that are quite practical about kind of living with the water and knowing that it wasn't just a recreational space, but that we shared it. And I have many experiences of swimming and knowing that there were other creatures in the sea. And so I'll leave it at that. Some other experiences, but I would say those are quite strong ones. And I think about that quite a bit in the New York City kind of waterfronts now, in my community of African immigrants and Caribbean neighbors, and how much knowledge we hold about waterfronts. That's a bit hidden sometimes. Thank you.
suppose I can go next if that's all right. Okay. First of all, yeah, thank you so much for, convening this. I feel really fortunate to be able to be here, and Makalé and Kristiy, what both of you have said resonates very deeply with me. Forgive me, I'm dealing with a bit of laryngitis, so if I have to drink water and so on, that's that's what I have to do. So I grew up on the coastline of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I think in so many ways, most of my, environmental consciousness in its various, aspects, environmental geopolitics, the relationship between culture and the environment, spirituality and the environment, and the kind of crossings over of all of those different things to produce our current, environmental reality and possible solutions came from living there. And so there are many ways I think that I suppose all of us can potentially answer this question. But the first thing that came to mind was that really my sense of the profound connection between music and the environment came from the daily experience of being by the sea, and in some ways learning music by the sea. Starting when I was a teenager, every day after school, I would go to the beach that was close to my house, and I would just be by the water and listen to the waves and kind of sing and experience the voice just dissolving into a space that's so much bigger than a single human. And just being there taught me a lot about time and perspective and the harmony of elements and things that I only realized later have kind of informed my music making in a very deep way. So I think in addition to being kind of growing into a political consciousness or a specific cultural consciousness through time and the environment, also the mystical power of being in nature and being close to nature, I think is something that I wanted to bring up as a very important foundational experience as well.
Yeah, well, as a Haudenosaunee person, and the Haudenosaunee are the six nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, whose homelands now comprise about 80% of what's now New York State. So I have profound ties to the land here, and we have very different ideas about and relationships to land than the settler colonial ones. I don't really think of myself as an environmental artist, but I would say that my realization that you can't separate environmental issues from colonial issues came vividly into my awareness probably in 1989 when I did a project for the Public Art Fund. They invited me to do a temporary outdoor installation pretty much anywhere I suggested, that would be legal. And I suggested a little pocket park in Lower Manhattan, just below sort of the court districts, family court and municipal court and criminal court. A little pocket park that was the site of a large freshwater pond that the colonials called the Collect. That was also the site of a huge shell midden left over from generations of the native people, consuming oysters on the site. And the reason I saw this was that I came across it in the Columbia Historical Portrait of the City of New York. I came across a print that showed a large pond and surrounded by hills that I couldn't account for in Lower Manhattan. And so it turned out that this 50-acre pond and wetland system that had been left behind by glaciers and had existed for eons was destroyed in a short 200 years. You know, it went from being this beautiful site, freshwater, you know, spring-fed pond with all the life that its pond supports or a lake supports, to being, you know, grossly polluted by things like distilleries and tanneries that had set themselves up on its banks, you know, basically extractive, you know, industries. And I thought that was really pretty astounding that such a natural feature could be completely erased. You know, the midden was bulldozed essentially into the pond as fill, you know, wiping out all that history. And the pond was literally buried there, you know, that was drained. The outlet to the pond was Canal Street, you know, it's now Canal Street. And then the notorious Tombs prison and execution ground was built over it. And I just thought that was the most amazing sequence, such a significant, you know, sequence of events. And it was really been the basis of my practice of examining sites for sort of regressing their histories and seeing what you know, led them to whatever their present you know, incarnation is. And it inevitably involves you know, dealing with settler colonial history and the settler colonial mindsets that you know, exploited and destroyed so many ecosystems.
Thank you, Alan. So I noticed that there were a couple of patterns here when you guys were talking. And I think that maybe we can get into that after we answer the second question. So I just want to ask the panelists to take a minute and think very critically about that moment that you just described or that experience that you underwent. And think about how accessible is this experience to others? And also, what are some of the access and or inclusion obstacles that someone might face if they chose to follow the same path that you did? So pretty much just think about that experience and in a way, try and see how accessible is this experience to others? How is it? How can someone that looks at you and is like, wow, I want to do exactly what they did. I want to follow in on their footsteps. How accessible is this experience to them in order for them to be able to get to where you're at? And Makalé, if you want to start us off.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a deep question, because we don't all start in the same place. We don't all end in the same place. So it's also relative. I guess for me, this way of sort of noticing and sort of noticing my place and sort of, let's see, I'm not going to start with the kind of my career, but I'm going to kind of maybe talk about just having access to waterfronts. So I guess it's something that's on my mind. There's, I think in the sort of capitalist environment that we live in here, certainly in New York City, but it's global. The experiences that I had were both very common and also very restrictive. So if you take my experiences in, you know, Long Island Sound, I would say those were, you know, it had to do with access to real estate and ownership, home ownership. It's the same in Guinea and in Conakry, João Fadiouth in Senegal, or places where my family is, where you have certain people who want cultural traditions, might want to acquire land and own it. And and then sort of place a boundary around it so that you don't have access to it. And I think there's a kind of different worldview and mindset that I and my family have, our cultures have, which is much more about shared resources. And so I guess I would say access to real estate and home ownership is an impediment. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that also has come up for me is, and this is more not located in New York, but in West Africa, is sort of the things that feel sort of beyond our control, which are, you know, I returned there before my son was born, it's about 7 years ago. And you know, these waterfronts were kind of covered in plastic debris, a lot of trash, and this has to do with sort of, you know, international sort of negotiations of sort of, you know, water rights and access, you know, to sort of dumping grounds and sort of some corrupted, you know, agreements that have been made. And so I think there's a kind of sense of powerlessness that happens there. But I think, like Priya mentioned, of, you know, those of us who grew up on the waterfront, spent time there, there are always ways that you can sort of find a quiet space and sort of walk into, you know, onto the shore. And the ocean does sort of dissipate this to a certain degree, but I will let someone else kind of speak.
Oh, sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Oh,
Did you want to speak, or did you?
I'm happy to. If you want to go ahead.
Oh no, I mean, either way works. I just no, Makalé, so much of what you say resonates so directly with my own experience. I mean, I suppose, yeah, in theory, the experience of just going to the ocean and simply sitting there and communing with the water is a pretty accessible one. But you know, where I grew up in a pretty heavily commercialized tourist district, where the beachfront is kind of under continuous threat and continuous assault by neoliberalism in its various forms, especially the tourism industry and especially the real estate industry, you know. So there's this constant risk of the oceanfront being, you know, bought up, being exploited, being degraded, you know, and so much of what you described, you know, happens there as well. You know, there's so much plastic pollution, and there's just such, it's so easy. I feel like the whole zone has kind of been, you know, appropriated for the worst in us, you know, for the desire to possess and for the desire to just interact with nature in this really superficial way, or to use it just for your own gain or your own self-aggrandizement or your own ego. And so that is, I mean, that's something that's always there and always present. And so sometimes I feel like just that simple relationship and that simple communion, which I think is is a very, very important part of the experience of anyone living on the coast, especially in light of climate change, especially when there are storms and there's sea level rise and there's a need for us to kind of reckon with nature. You know, that whole experience is kind of, there's a fragility to it, which there shouldn't be, because of this kind of constant threat of these industries just, you know, not caring about the well-being of people and not caring about the well-being of the ecosystem. And it's just such a huge, these feel like such behemoths, you know, they feel like such huge systems, and it's very easy to feel powerless in the face of them. And so I really appreciate everything you said, and it resonates very deeply for us too.
I'm happy to go. Yeah, real estate. We call it dispossession. You know, the accessibility of history is an issue in America. I think it was Gore Vidal who said it's the United States of amnesia. And I think that this, you know, this suppression of a more accurate history that pierces some of the myths of, American myths of, for example, the wilderness myth, the idea that the United States was this pristine and mostly empty wilderness, lightly occupied by some backward peoples that needed to be, pushed out of the way. Like that sort of ideology is still being taught. And so our children are being conditioned to normatize and normalize what is an appalling set of historical facts about the way this country was settled. So that history is theoretically accessible to Americans, but again, because of this conditioning, it's not that accessible. So one of the things that art can do, or that I see, in a way, my project being, is to make them accessible, to make them more accessible. So working in a public art space is one way to reach a broad audience, not just the people who, the sort of, self-selected people who go to museums and so forth. So I'm very, very happy that art has that potential. And it also has the potential to move people in a way that, science doesn't seem to, or that dry historical fact doesn't seem to. Because I think it hits you in this sort of place that's, mind and heart at the same time. So it's hard to escape it, if it's good. And what really, the reason I'm here today is because a project I just finished at the, well, that's a new work that that's at the Greater New York Show at PS1, where I partnered, with the generous support of the Billion Oyster Project on this piece called Midden that projects an overlay of video onto 3 tons of oyster shells that they loaned me for this. And I think much in the way that the United States is this overlay over indigenous land and water. I was trying to analogize that in a way with the video being projected over the shells of animals, And in our culture, we don't really separate ourselves from the land or from other forms of life. So, we've suffered similar fates under settler colonialism. You can't really separate the degradation that was directed against us, that we suffered, from the degradation directed against the environment, against our lands. That's all.
That was amazing. I wanted to build off of that because I feel like that's like very direct thread to what I wanted to share about art and accessibility. I feel like art has not been tapped into enough, especially in the environmental space, because I feel like we've relied so heavily on science, as was mentioned, and data. And while that does provide a groundwork to talk about why we're in the situation we're in from one standpoint, it leaves out so many other narratives on why we're in the situation we're in, including settler colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchal oppression of nature, so on and so forth. It leaves out so many of these other stories that science just simply hasn't covered enough of. And so I would say that with my own work, obviously I'm more in media, and I put myself out there in a communications and like marketing way, I guess you could say. And I would say that when I was first starting out with this, the whole reason I even created my platform is because this space was so inaccessible. That's literally why I created Brown Girl Green, is because I didn't see these narratives being talked about, and felt like a lot of this work, whether it was getting in touch with the outdoors, or getting to learn about what we can do about climate change and environmental policy and all these things, were like either trapped in academia or really like enshrined in overwhelmingly inaccessible spaces that felt like only certain people got access to. And I would say that like I was privileged enough to come from an immigrant family where my mom sacrificed a lot so I could do things like unpaid internships. And a lot of my friends and colleagues could not do that. They were worried about paying off their student loan debt, worried about taking care of their family. And I acknowledge that privilege wholly, that the reason I was able to explore art truly came out of the opportunities in which I had the time and the spaciousness to explore my role as a creative and as an artist. And I would say that like not everyone can do that. And I have to be honest about that. But I would say at the same time, it's of the utmost importance that we make that more accessible to more people, because we need more people in the conversation. And it's actually like mission critical. It can't be this inaccessible thing. It has to be a practice and a skill share that's shared amongst various generations and cultural backgrounds, where there can be active listening and sharing with each other, in order to make storytelling and art this tool for the movement to move forward. And I would say for me, like a lot of my work is about providing a platform for people who do come from frontline communities, and come from communities that have not been heard or included in this conversation. And I also acknowledge that I don't necessarily come directly from a community that's on a front line of environmental racism. And that also is a huge privilege that I come from. And so I would say that it's important also for people doing this work to recognize that acknowledging your positionality and privilege does not have to lock you into this space of shame. It should inspire you to utilize and tap into the resources you do have and the strengths you have to support, uplift, and collaborate with those who don't have access to those things. And so I would say with this question, with obstacles and inclusivity, it's about recognizing maybe some guilt or shame that maybe you feel, your eco-anxiety that you may feel while being in this space, but acknowledging that you need to work with others and be in community with others in order for there to be traction. And so that's my response to this question.
Tatiana, do you mind if I say something really quickly? It's just, you both have inspired me as your work, but one thing that, this is a kind of leading to sort of celebrating of a poet, kind of writer that really inspired me. But when I first started working with the New York City Soil and Water Conservation District, we were based out of Ecology Village and Floyd Bennett Field in Jamaica Bay. And I'm working on a National Parks Foundation project called Every Kid Outdoors. And it was, there's a lot about kind of getting to that place and the communities surrounding Jamaica Bay that are difficult. But one of the things that was really interesting was that my mentor at the USDA NRCS, Richard Shaw, is a really wonderful person, had been working with Martin Rabenhorst, University of Maryland, about sort of subaqueous soils and our shallow water sediments soils. And the kind of the view for a long time was that shallow water sediments weren't technically soil, because in order for them to be soil, there needed to be sort of a pedogenic process that was happening, something, additions, losses, transformations. And so the idea was that soil formation couldn't take place underwater. And I felt like, for many reasons, because the outreach to the community, which was complicated in a way, the surrounding community, the kind of sociology of it, marginalization of the community, that were more interested in going into Manhattan for cultural experiences rather than maybe going to the shore. But that's like a lot to unpack, and I don't want to. One of the things that happened was that there was some field research in Sinapatuxent Bay in Maryland, and I spent part of my childhood in Maryland and Virginia. And the research as a soil scientist were saying that, just because something is submerged under shallow water doesn't mean it doesn't change and can't form soils. And so they, and Alan, what you said about your most recent piece reminded me of this, that they saw that there was an accumulation of shells, different bivalve mollusks and hard clams and jackknife clams, and which deposited some calcium carbonate and kind of was beginning to create horizons in the soils. But also there was a really strong evidence for some soil development, pedogenic additions with eelgrass blades and salt marsh cordgrass stems. So there was kind of organic carbon data that was really similar to terrestrial soil. And I was really thinking about, and metaphorically as artists do, what it means to kind of grow and develop when you're submerged under something. In this case, it was water. And there was someone, he teaches at Queens College, Steve Mentz. He's a wonderful writer. And I ended up bringing him onto a project. It was a production we were doing, a symposium. And he wrote a book called Ocean. He talks about kind of just changing our language. And he offered these 7 words to move offshore. And I find them really helpful. One is distortion. I'll just share 2 or 3. And he's an open water swimmer. So I love that, Tatiana, you started with a kind of our personal entry into all of this, but that water bends light, and water thinking makes distortion a baseline condition. And I think that's really useful way of thinking about some of this work. And then flow, formerly progress. And, just thinking in terms of cyclical flows rather than a kind of linear progress, he says, makes historical narratives messier, more confusing, and less familiar. And those are really good things. So I know that we're kind of in sequence with some questions here, but I just wanted to share that the artists have really helped my thinking and about place, especially, with visual artists and public artwork, and also poets, and just really changing the language we use to describe our places. I know I work with some artists in Akwesasne, so yeah, there's a different vocabulary that we need to access that exists.
Thank you so much for that, Makalé. And I wanted to quickly point out one of the patterns that I did see, even from the first question, and I think just the second question just reinforced that, which is accessibility, whether it's accessibility to real estate, to waterfront access, to unpaid internships, accessibility to art. It really is all connected, and we can find ways to connect all of these things, and kind of find that if accessibility isn't an option for a lot of people, it really creates a disadvantage, right? And I think that can kind of like put us into this third question, which I'm just going to give you guys a quick definition of what intersectional environmentalism is, just so that it's fresh in your mind and you can kind of see how this third question really connects with this term. This term is largely inspired by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and her work with intersectional feminism. So this is an inclusive form of environmentalism that advocates for the protection of all people and the planet. It also identifies the ways in which injustices affecting marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected, right? So there's that word again, like interconnected, where it's all connected. Intersectional environmentalism not only acknowledges these links, but it also brings them to the forefront of environmental activism without minimizing or silencing overt and discrete forms of oppression. So whether it's real estate, whether it's art, accessibility to a lot of experiences that our panelists were just discussing, it's vital. Accessibility, it's vital to be able to get this message across culturally. I know, like through different platforms, we need to be able to connect with one another and find those connections within each other, right? So for the panelists, in your various fields, where do you see the biggest challenges to intersectionality and opportunities to address environmental justice? This could be equity, access, or inclusion in that space. How do you see this being, what are the biggest challenges that you see in this?
Well, intersectionality, if I understand it correctly, accounts for the multiple ways in which people are excluded or subordinated, for example, not just by race, let's say, but by race and gender, or race with sexual orientation and the like. I think as it was first conceived, and in the context it was conceived, it was a useful lens, or it is a useful lens in which to look at discrimination and detect it. But I'm not sure how useful a lens it is in viewing and addressing the unique circumstances of Indigenous people and their relationship to the environment and to environmental justice. I'm not sure how adequate these present environmental frameworks are, because missing from them are the centrality of settler colonialism and its history, and the differences in the ways that Indigenous people view and their experience with land and nature, which is ancient, and the differences that stem from the fact that we have a political relationship with the state. We are nations, even if our sovereignty has been compromised, first from the doctrine of discovery, which were based on papal bulls of the 15th century, legitimizing the seizure of Indigenous lands by European colonists, which is still bizarrely the foundation for Indigenous law, or for law, governing Indigenous people in the US. There was a famous court decision, a Supreme Court decision in 1823 that somehow demoted us from sovereign nations to domestic dependent nations. That has never, been reversed. So I'm not, I see the whole idea of, if intersectionality is really about interconnectedness, yes. But if it's really about the sort of, I don't know, the idea of equalizing and universalizing experiences of oppression, that I think it's not adequate.
I just wanted to build off of that. I would say that, like, if you universalize the oppression of different groups, especially when it comes to environmental racism, that really doesn't provide a strategic plan to pressure policymakers to pass specific pools of funding that are going to get distributed in a strategic way to actually meet the needs of certain communities. And so I would say that, like, an amazing initiative is the Justice 40 initiative, that is pushing for greater funding for environmental justice initiatives. But again, even then, there's discussion that that funding is not adequate enough to meet the needs of so many various communities. So I would say, the fact that a lot of communities that are on the front lines are like having to struggle for resources leads to almost like a competition, where different groups like Indigenous folks, Black folks, Asian, Latinx, it's almost like we have to be pit against each other for colonizer funds, and we have to like fight over each other and kind of like push people down, trying to talk people up. And I think that can cause internal destruction, where people get too much of like their ego into it, and I think that that's something that we're gonna have to really compete with, because if as Black, Indigenous people of color, like if our only unifier is that we are against white folks who do have access to resources and land and all these things, that's not a great standpoint. There has to be something more than that that unifies us, and that has to be out of a space of recognizing our positionality, and being and treating this as an active process rather than we've reached this goal of intersectionality and then that's the end all be all. Like intersectionality has to be a verb, not a noun. It has to be an active practice. And I would say that if you really embody intersectionality, it's about recognizing that you're consistently maybe going to get it wrong, and then that's okay, and that there needs to be listening and there needs to be conversation. And I think that that's how you create more strategic movements. So I just wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what both of you said, and it makes me think of how, I mean, the arts is one way to really give real substance and depth and dimension and texture to the things that we talk about when we talk about environmental justice and environmental history and politics and everything, you know. I mean, my focus is music, but I think this is true for any art form, you know. It can potentially be such a great way to convey history, to convey wisdom, to convey worldviews, and it's a very, these are very subtle, very moving forms of communication that could really help us to understand our current global environmental crisis and imagine alternatives and connect to our feelings about everything that is happening and the specificities of different people's experiences. But one thing that I've found, I think, to be a real barrier in the world of music these days is that the industry and the system of, you know, distributing and promoting music is kind of, it's sort of built upon and thrives on principles which stand in pretty stark contrast to what environmental music is. You know, when I first started this project, Music in the Earth, I was so interested in it because this seemed to be, you know, this intersection of music and the environment seemed to be one of the most ancient and universal subjects, and it seemed to me that it had huge you know, healing potential, social potential, cultural potential, and that really the role of music these days and in the environmental movement is to facilitate a real depth of engagement with the issue. But the thing is that, I mean, although in recent years it's become easier for independent musicians to release music and things, there's still, the whole system is still quite superficial and quite ego-driven. You know, engagement is measured in terms of likes and shares, and you know, you know, musicians are encouraged to kind of build personality cults around themselves that distract from the importance of the music. And so I think that a lot of musicians who want to, you know, use their art to really contribute to the environmental movement find themselves in the grips of a system that's not designed for them. It's designed for a very different, much more kind of commercialized and much more, you know, much less rich form of engaging with media.
Thank you, everyone. I just to add to the responses, I guess I thought about what you said, Alan and Kristiy and Priya, about what gets centered and who gets centered. And I kind of feel the same sort of, it's not torment, but I'm not sure, yeah, if we should try to kind of push in and kind of try to be at the table with the gatekeepers, or we kind of should move aside. I mean, I keep this quote in my mind with Stephen Satterfield. He runs this magazine, Whetstone. And he says, you know, when the gatekeepers are diverse, so too are the stories, its tellers, and their experiences. And this diversity accelerates our collective knowledge and empathy. And I guess for me, I think about that and how there are so few options for access to full-time jobs. in this field. It's very, you know, to kind of pursue a career in environmental science or ecology is, you know, it's just not it's not a diverse experience. And it's not that, you know, you only need to be an academic or a field scientist to do that. But I do think that that's a really big obstacle to creating programming that mirrors communities, you know, and so you know, and you see it in job descriptions. I think there is some in terms of practicality, like I mean, when there's an intentionality behind even how job descriptions are written, so that, you know, there isn't a requirement to have worked in a, you know, particular land trust in a particular rural area. I mean, unless the job is in a rural area. I mean, it's a lot of the places are not necessarily safe or desirable for a lot of us to live and work in. And I say that as an urban person, but it also happens in places in Biloxi. And, you know, it's just, I think access to full-time jobs is an issue. A lot of us are called in for part-time contract work. And I think opportunities, yeah, for access and inclusion also have to do with, I mean, just a culture of public programs and public art. And, you know, a lot of times even the music that's played at different, you know, environmental events doesn't resonate with the people who are in the community. And so I think those seemingly maybe small sort of nuanced decisions are actually really, they resonate quite a bit. And yeah, I would say just diversifying the people who sit at the table. And again, I struggle with that because in a lot of ways, my community is also quite strong, and a lot of us have decided to do our own work and pool our own resources, of which we have many, instead of try to kind of continually knock on the door of a lot of these environmental organizations. But you can't totally deny them. I mean, you know, if you're an artist, you know, you're not going to turn down an opportunity to exhibit your work at the Whitney or at the Met. You know, I mean, there's a currency that comes with that, you know, is worthwhile. But I do think that a lot of us are increasingly sort of disinterested in, you know, trying to continually ask to be at the table, and instead just kind of, you know, set our own table.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so I was able to capture, you know, a couple of points that were made about this, you know, in regards to this question. And, you know, equity, access, or inclusion all can look very different to everyone. And depending on the site, depending on the culture, depending on, there's so many variables that can affect the way that equity, access, and inclusion are and what lens they're being seen under. And a lot of the challenges that were mentioned by our panelists stem from different areas, right? So Makalé, you mentioned, you know, just being able to have full-time jobs, being full-time jobs being offered to in certain communities or in different fields, or in this field specifically, you know, with ecology and environmental sciences. That's one challenge that we face, not just now, but we're probably going to continue to face that challenge in the future. Also, Alan, you mentioned that, you know, just the definition itself of intersectional environmentalism can be, you know, a bit daunting, kind of like, okay, what is it that we're talking about? One of the challenges that we could face is the definition itself, and how far are we willing to carry it? What is it that we're looking at when we're talking about this topic? Sorry about that. And just kind of wanting to look at that question and look at the bigger picture. What are the challenges that we're not just facing now, but we'll be facing in the future, right? So I think that kind of really connects us to our next question, which has to do with our safe space commitment. And if you guys haven't had the opportunity to take a look at the Billion Oyster Project Safe Space Commitment, I really suggest that you do. This commitment is a contract that was created by the Billion Oyster Project and HEB to be able to kind of create some sort of agreement that must be signed by organizational, corporate, and sponsor partners to uphold behavior that is appropriate, non-oppressive, and inclusive, and act in a situation where commitment is broken, right? So, and if we're looking at intersectional environmentalism, and if we're looking at inclusivity, it really helps to have a lot of people sitting at this table when we're having this conversation. And this document isn't a document that's like, this is a finalized thing and this is how it's going to stay. This is something that we hope to be able to improve on as time goes, as we hear more voices, as we hear different opinions, as we hear like, hey, actually, I like what this says, but also can you add some language that also includes this community. So that we can create a safer space for everyone, right? But in order for us to create a safer space for everyone, we have to allow everyone to have a seat at the table. So for the panelists, you guys have had an opportunity to look at the Safe Space Commitment. Do you see this commitment applying in your field? If yes, how so? If not, what other solutions or opportunities have taken shape to address environmental justice and promote intersectionality in your areas of expertise?
I think that the agreement is very well written, and I'm sure that it'll be helpful. There are so many elements, I believe, that go into creating safe spaces, and each situation is very different and kind of requires its own, each situation is very different. So I've been thinking about safe spaces, and more generally spaces that are free from prevailing power relations, and spaces where it's possible to truly be and to truly express what is true to you, express your experiences of injustice, collectively imagine alternatives. I've been thinking of safe spaces in all of these different ways since I was a college student. And I guess my first introduction to the subject came from studying histories of different safe spaces, especially in the Greater Caribbean, so the Caribbean islands, Brazil, the Yucatan, the New Orleans, that whole, that and what's considered the Greater Caribbean. And so I believe that history offers a lot of examples of safe spaces that can give some nice perspective. And then, I've also been involved in different fields like multi-faith, climate activism, and community arts, and more lately, the sort of music-based environmental consciousness raising spaces that we've been doing with Music in the Earth. And through those experiences, I feel like one thing that I've come to understand is that agreements like this are important, but there's so many other harder to pin down elements that are also incredibly important, like building trust and having an ambiance that makes people feel comfortable. And ultimately, I feel like safe spaces really need to truly engage the spirit of those involved, and the arts can be an effective way to do that. Inclusion and such things are, they're about these stated intents, but it's also, I think, about considering really what will make the people who you are working with feel free.
I like the concept of safe space. I feel like this document is an extremely localized sort of form of an aspirational, the aspirational aspect of safe space, which has also, been developed in the UN. If we look internationally at the idea of safe space, we have the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which, among other former British colonies, the United States hesitated to sign for a long time, and signed with something like 12 pages of disavowals. I think that the problem with these things is that they generalize and they universalize, and they try to sort of slot in everybody's experience as a sort of, part of this mosaic of empowerment. And I think it's hard to do when everything that goes on this continent, which we call Turtle Island, involves us. And we're very rarely sitting at the table, despite political relationships that are obligations of the state to bring us in. We're left with a reduced form of sovereignty where the state is obligated to consult with us, but not to get our consent. And that is really wreaking havoc with everything. I mean, it's not just about protecting our waters. And by our waters, we're not just talking about water, which is how the environmental talks about it. It's water. We're talking about specific waters that we have, profound relationships with for eons. So I think until this, what I see is there's this sort of, elephant in the room that's not being recognized, which is that everything is seeming to stem out of the settler colonial takeover of Turtle Island, and the reduction of our numbers. We don't have a powerful political voice. It's great that we have Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary right now, but we're generally not, considered to have a sort of, we don't rise to a certain number that gets us a seat at a lot of different tables, including cultural ones. So I think it's time not to compete for some sort of centering, but just to acknowledge that this has been a huge void in the discussion, and that it needs to be, the discussion needs to be indigenized beyond the point that it is right now.
What you're saying is about voice, like I agree, this is it's a really nice aspirational document. And one of the things that I noticed when I was thinking about how this could be used at, Soil Survey or NRCS, Natural Areas Conservancy, all the organizations. And it really feels very much, I say as a Black woman, that it's by and for whites who are already at the table, right? So it's about kind of a sort of increasing sort of cultural competency. And that's hard to do sometimes, right? You're expected to be aware of your language, take action as a supportive bystander. And I was trying to put myself in there, how do I take action as a supportive bystander? Well, I would probably phrase this differently, right? If I was to write it. And I'm not saying this wasn't written by a diverse group of people, but that's how I receive it. Continue to evaluate your involvement in a way that people and organizations and businesses perpetuate injustice. And I guess I would, I think that it is really useful in a lot of ways, but I tend to, my experience, I've found that some other language is more helpful because it's not about, sort of increasing the cultural competency of a group of people who are already in power. Because I don't think that needs to be done, but that kind of puts a real burden on us. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, in my head, there was like a lot of signals going off, like, well, how would these people be held accountable if like they didn't do this, and ultimately would require like Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks to like report it. And then that puts emotional burden and labor back on us. And it's like, well, that's annoying because, like, you're not even, it's like you sign this commitment and then ultimately we're the ones that are going to have to make you implement it. And that's exhausting. But I would just say that, like, in my own experience, like, organizations that actually embody this and don't need to sign a document are doing the work. And I feel like I've identified allyship by people who are willing to take a step back to like in their programming and ensure that there is that recentering. I love what Alan was saying. There needs to be bigger centering specifically of Indigenous voices, and that should already just be embedded in the DNA of the programming. Like, that's where the funding and the resources should be going. Instead of making this commitment to safe space, actually make your actions show that through the redistribution of your power and your platforms. And I would say that that's not happening enough, because it's like they want to bring us token brown people into these spaces to get their PR points. And then afterwards, it's like, okay, well, you still got to apply to these grant programs, still got to scramble to like scrap together resources for you and your community and hope for the next project is going to get funded because we're the ones that have all the resources. Instead of there being, let's have an intentional discussion on how we have these resources and we're willing to relinquish some of them in order to be able to support the work that the critical work you're doing on the ground. And I think that that's the more important conversation beyond just like baseline cultural competency is, are people willing to challenge their own ego to be willing to give up some of that power and control? And that's the big question. And I think that, especially for white folks, I don't know if they're ready for that yet. Maybe, and the people who are doing that work because I met them, because they've shared their resources with me. And those are the people I trust. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a lot about like having co-directors of programs, like sharing power. I mean, they're foundations who are interested in supporting staff lines that offer shared power. You know, and I was curious about what you all think about, and sorry, Priya, I know you're going to contribute to this too, all right, about the kind of land disclosures that kind of, you know, kind of either punctuate, you know, a kind of conversation. I've found those to be, and I think people have been talking about this, kind of in some ways a bit empty, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of the safe space agreements. I don't know if Alan or Kristiy or Priya, if you could speak to that, sort of acknowledging that you're on a specific land, which is somewhat powerful, but then what, you know, what happens after that? And it seems to me to be related to these documents.
If I can approach that. I think a place to start, you know, is to try to honor, you know, existing treaties, which are supposed to be the highest law of the land, because those treaties, you know, have been violated. I think every one of them, and can you imagine, you know, the difference in environmental health that could result from the Lakota people, you know, being returned the sacred Black Hills? I mean, it leads to something that's quite radical, which is the idea of land back, and the control not just of you know, environmental, you know, the direction of environmental organizations, but really, you know, where the rubber meets the road, really the land itself and how it's being treated, and who gets to call the shots there. So, you know, I think that we have to really open our minds at this stage to reimagining, to take in this history that we've all been sort of led away from, and then figure out, you know, what should be done to right some of those appalling wrongs. And settler colonialism did not just affect us, it affected, you know, Africans and African Americans hugely. It's the other side of the coin of settler colonialism. And I think that, you know, the coalitions that we can make with each other and with everyone who can, you know, who wants to protect land and water, you know, I think those are all good things. But I think that ultimately, this question, which has really never been properly addressed by the nation, and is a festering sort of wound on it, which is the dispossession of Native people from their homelands. You know, until the United States is ready for that, until people are ready for that, and they don't seem ready at all, I think we're going to be, you know, playing sort of musical chairs and not necessarily getting to the heart of the matter.
I'm really glad this has come up. One subject that I spent several chapters in my first book, which is called The Politics of Coexistence in the Atlantic World, covering was Maroon Settlements in the Greater Caribbean. And so for those who don't know, across the Caribbean islands, as well as in these coastal regions that border the Caribbean, are numerous what are called Maroon Settlements, which are these settlements of people of, you know, Afro-descendant and Indigenous peoples who were fleeing from colonial violence, who came together and created these sort of alternate societies that were far away from the centers of colonial power. And there's, you know, there are several in Puerto Rico, there's many in Brazil that are called quilombos, and they're just really interesting spaces where new social philosophies were forged and new kind of very profoundly decolonial ways of living were developed. And so in that sense, they really seem like good examples of safe spaces. And so in Brazil, the quilombos were where musical genres like capoeira developed, and so in Brazil in particular in the 90s, there was this effort to give land titles to the inhabitants of these quilombos, and there was an article that was put into the new Brazilian constitution about this, and so one of my chapters was about how the implementation of that article did or didn't kind of capture and coincide with the spirit of these settlements. And I think often what happened was that the way that this inclusion kind of happened in practice was very problematic, because it made the descendants of these quilombolas have to go through this huge sort of bureaucratic rigmarole and prove that they belong to this, that they belong to these communities, and prove that they deserve to have, titles over this land. And so in that sense, what really captured the spirit and the autonomy and the agency of these places more was the music, and it was the social philosophies that came out of them. And so these are good examples of how legal agreements and policies do or don't play out well in practice when you're dealing with dramatic dramatic differences in the way that communities see history and see themselves. And I guess that the potential kind of conflicts and complications when you have law and culture and spirituality and art come together in these sort of politics of reparation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Priya. We only have 5 minutes left. So time really flew by, but I wanted to just kind of take a minute or two to highlight, everything our panelists just talked about. I think it's really important to be able to have these kinds of conversations. And I'm really, really glad that we're having this conversation, and that our panelists were able to point out some of the things or that they saw and how they felt, or what the first thing that kind of came to mind when they read the safe space commitment. I apologize. So I think that these kinds of conversations help us see things from different perspectives. And they also help us improve the concepts that we were trying to put forward, right? So we came up with this idea of the safe space commitment. Mostly it stemmed from the Billion Oyster Project wanting to make sure that there was some sort of document that we could use to hold our partners and organizations that we partner with, or corporate organization, like all of these different entities, to kind of like hold them accountable to making sure that they are, creating a safe space for the student groups that we bring out, for community members that we bring out, for everybody that we engage with, to make sure that there was some sort of like document that highlighted like, hey, we don't want any of this being an issue. And if there is this is kind of like what we envision a safe space to be. And so hearing your feedback is really helpful, because now we can kind of look at it from a different angle, and also hopefully, add to it or improve it in ways that can be beneficial, but also look for other ways outside of the safe space commitment to make sure that the spaces that we're bringing our communities onto feel safer in a way that people feel free and comfortable being there. And I think that that's a start. We wanted to start off small. So, we wanted to start off with the organizations that we partner with, but hopefully, this picks up momentum and we can kind of expand it in ways that are not just on a piece of paper, but, through actions, through, behaviors, through different ways that are outside of just signing a document. Right. So I'm really glad that we got the chance to talk about it. We did have a couple of questions in the chat, and I wanted us to try and answer those very quickly before our time is up. And so let's take a look. There were a couple of questions for Yalan, and I'm going to try and find these in the chat. So how someone asked, they were wondering how you think we can work together to change the way that land is treated, given the reality that we live in. And I know that you mentioned at one point, honoring existing treaties, which are the highest law of the land. And I know that was probably one of the things that that were mentioned during our conversation. Is there anything else that you felt like might be helpful?
Well, yes, I mean, that's the place to start. But really, what needs to change is the consciousness around the environment, and so that can happen in a lot of different spaces. And I just think that I just hope that the movement can indigenize so as to not just romanticize and sort of pay lip service to indigenous ways, these ancient ways that we have with the land, these relations that we have. I'm not sure how to do it, except the way I do it is through art, but there's different ways to raise consciousness. But I think a historical consciousness is necessary, and that can happen in all different places, educational places and other sorts of spaces, art spaces, and political spaces. So I'm hoping that can happen.
Alrighty, thank you. Another question: what is the best way to elevate the voices of Indigenous people here in New York City, and how do you avoid how to avoid being performative?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I mean, I think that land acknowledgements are consciousness raising to people that haven't encountered them before, or maybe the repetition of them is consciousness raising. But I think the idea is to try to work locally, to know what that history is, to know that the people that were originally here, the Lenape, are scattered in diasporas, across Turtle Island. To know that the people that the large population of Native American people here are not the local population as you would find it in some place, let's say in the West, that was colonized later. So people need to educate themselves about Native Americans, I think, before they can effectively form coalitions with us, and it's not exactly our position to have to educate them. So it's something that they can do themselves, and they can, that would change things. Yeah.
There were so many good questions in the chat, and I wish we could answer all of them, because I think they're very, very valuable questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to thank the speakers and the audience for being here, for their participation, for the questions that they put out. I also wanted to thank Con-Edison for sponsoring, and for HEP for hosting this discussion. I wanted to invite everyone to check out the Billion Oyster Project website, which is billionoysterproject.org, to find out more about the work that this organization is doing and how you can support us in the best way and how to get involved. Maybe you could even come out and volunteer. There have also, just a quick plug, there were also some job postings that were just put out. So if you guys want to check those out, feel free to do so. I believe they were put on WOVA, so definitely go on and check those out. I just wanted to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for the knowledge that you just shared with us, for your sharing your experiences, for just giving us so much insight. It's really, really valuable to us. And if you guys want to drop your emails, you can absolutely do that, so that people can contact you directly with any questions that they might have. Or if you want to drop your Instagram handles or social media platforms so people can follow you on social media, definitely do that. If anybody has any questions that you want us to direct to the panelists, or if you want to just email them yourselves, also feel free to do so. We look forward to continuing this conversation. I want to make sure that we respect everyone's time. We're 2 minutes over. Isabel, I don't know if you had any other comments that you wanted to make before we go.
I just also wanted to say thank you, and thank you to Tatiana and Billion Oyster Project for organizing such a wonderful panel. So thank you very much. And everybody, please stay tuned. Our next session up is at 11 o'clock for the conference, and it will be a session on making wetlands part of the New York City story. So we're talking about new wetlands plans from the city and from parks, and we're getting responses from the community and from factors of resilience and politics, and so you won't want to miss it. Thank you, everyone.